I'm using water-based markers for the first time ever, and I want to take you along and share my do's and don'ts with water-based markers, which by the way are so different to alcohol markers in my experience. So Ohuhu kindly sent me this 60 marker set, as well as these journal dot pens, which I'll get into a bit later. Now, one side of the pen is a brush nib and the other side is a fine liner tip. And by the way, I filmed this whole video in a coffee shop, which is another first for me. I've done art in coffee shops before, but I've never filmed a whole video, and it was so fun. So many people chatted with me throughout this process, and I really loved it. So I started with my very rough and loose sketches. I went with veggies because they have multiple colours and I'm comfortable with them as a subject, which is what I needed for using a new medium. I did super simple sketches and then I erased the heavy lines so that they wouldn't show through. Looking at my reference photo, I selected the colours that I thought would be most useful for this illustration, and I also went ahead and swatched on this paper just because this paper was slightly different to the swatch paper I had previously used, and I wanted to see how the colour showed up on it. With markers, I like to build from light to dark, so I started like that with this process too, being really mindful of the highlights. Now, water-based markers take a really long time to dry, and this is a great thing if you love blending because you can really go in and blend between the colours as the ink sits on the page for a while. You just have to be super careful not to smudge the colours. I also found that the colours would bleed into each other quite a bit, and this is probably a good thing if you're used to like watercolour and you like that effect. As you can see, I'm really just laying down patches of colour and not really going back and forth between the different colours because I could see this blooming effect happening and I wanted to minimize that. Here I began using one of the lighter oranges to go back and forth between the harsher lines and blend out a little bit. And here is where I kind of learned that they were super blendable and that I could really mix and make those harsh lines disappear. The fine line tip was really helping me to get some definition back on those edges that I felt were bleeding a little bit into the white of the page. So I really enjoyed using that fine liner to kind of give that definition. I feel like the carrot went well. I really used this first illustration to understand how the ink was interacting with the other ink on the page, the actual paper itself, and learning a little bit about how the medium was moving. But with the next illustration, the chili, I did feel like I was seeing a lot more of that blooming effect of the colours bleeding into each other. I felt like I was losing a lot of that crisper highlight that happens on a shiny fruit or vegetable, and I think this is because I kind of overblended because I was seeing this bleeding happening and I kept kind of scrubbing over where that bleeding was happening. A tip I would give is to give your highlights ample space. So if you want to include the white of the page as the highlight, make sure that you make it slightly bigger to allow some of that bleeding to take over. And also don't overblend between colours back and forth because this is what led to my lighter colours to muddy a bit and then they got that kind of speckled effect. I don't think it was super unsuccessful as an illustration, but I do wish I had crisper highlights come through and I didn't have a white gel pen on me to experiment laying on some white gel pen as the highlights, so I couldn't do that for this one. Maybe in my next illustrations I'll make sure to have it and see how the gel pen lays over this kind of ink. But my chili helped me learn for my next illustration, so with the pepper I was a lot more mindful of leaving the highlights really untouched and actually using the blender marker that comes with the set to colour in some of those lighter values. So with alcohol markers I don't really use the blender marker, which is that colourless marker that you can use to blend between colours, But essentially with water markers, I found that blending was the perfect way of getting the effect I wanted and to blend out the colours and get lighter values with the colours. So I actually did use that blender marker quite a lot, which is actually why I think that if you're someone that struggles to blend with alcohol markers and you really want to achieve that blended look, you are going to love water-based markers because they're so easy to blend with. So here's a great example of how easy it is to blend these markers. So you can see there's a lot of harsh lines between the red and the orange on the pepper right now, but I'm just using a lighter value marker to go back and forth on those lines and really blend out any of those harsh lines, which is what I really think that lots of you want to achieve with alcohol markers, but alcohol markers are just a little bit different with how you blend them. These are super easy to blend out. You can see I'm leaving lots of white space where the highlights will go, as I learned from the chili pepper, and I'm using a lighter value to go in and make those a bit duller because they're not as white on the pepper. Here I'm going in with the fine liners to add some outline and bring everything all together, and I really love how this pepper turned out. It's super vibrant, super pigmented, and just very fun. Now the avocado is really going to show you the colourless blender in action because I really wanted to achieve really light values, but I didn't have those values in the markers. So I lay down a few colours and then use the blender to blend them out, and you can see how it disperses the pigment and gives a lighter value. Another tip for using the colourless blender is to make sure that you clean it every time you use it with different colours. So by cleaning it, I just mean scrub it back and forth on a page so that it gets rid of the previous pigment and it goes back to kind of being white or colourless, and that way it won't muddy your next colours. So it was a little bit red, and then I just kind of scrubbed it on a page and it cleaned it really well. I added the shadow of the avocado stone in kind of this bluish purple, which I think works really well for the shadow. And as you can see, this darker colour layered on really well. So I think they do layer super well. I just think that you have to let them dry a bit, kind of like gouache. Using the blue for the avocado made me think of layering the blue for also the jalapeno. Okay, so by the time I was doing this jalapeno, I felt a lot more confident and I was being a lot quicker and just knowing how to lay down the colours and not kind of go over and over too much. Where to use the colourless blender, how much highlight to leave if I wanted it to truly stay lighter in value, etc. So I feel like I breezed through the jalapeno and I like how it turned out. Then I went back and did some touch-ups to darken some of the values, and because the markers had dried, I feel like they were really laying on top of the illustrations a lot better and helping darken the values without bleeding everywhere, which was really good. So I wanted to experiment a bit with different textures, so I did this broccoli, and I think it's my least favorite one just because I feel like I couldn't get the texture of it quite right because of that bleeding that was happening. So I was dabbing the dots and then they would disperse because they'd bleed into the previous ink, and I think if I had allowed for the ink to dry a bit more and done this, it would have helped me build the layers better, but I was a bit impatient. So this kind of reminded me of my gouache process because I do often wait for the paint to dry a bit more if I don't want it to kind of bleed into itself. So I could have easily done that here and I think it would have helped. I had a lot of fun doing this and using these markers actually. The pros of them is that they were super vibrant, as you can see, super pigmented. They're really easy to blend and they kind of remind me of paint a lot more than alcohol markers do. The cons of them is that the ink stays wet for too long and it can be easy to smudge them, and it's hard to get lighter values, so you really have to rely on that colourless blender to make the lighter values. As I mentioned, Ohuhu also sent me the journal dot pens, and these are really for those of you who love calligraphy and journaling. Now, I am someone with a very messy handwriting. I've never really done calligraphy before. I took one class years and years ago, like a fun evening class on calligraphy, but I really wanted to try them out, so I thought it would be fun to add the names of the veggies on the page in my style. Essentially, what I know of calligraphy from that class that I took is that the pens that you use, they are kind of bendy, so you can put different pressure on them so that they can make either thinner or thicker lines, and this is what this one side of the pen has. I think adding this text was really fun and kind of in line with the illustrations. Have you ever used watermarkers before? Are you tempted to? Let me know, and thank you so much Ohuhu for sending these and sponsoring this video. I will see you in my next video. Bye!